Let's talk about creating Excel macros. You can create a macro with Excel commands by recording the keystrokes and mouse clicks, giving the macro a name, and specifying how to store the macro. A macro thus recorded can be run with an Excel command. Suppose you have to collect certain results repeatedly in the format shown here. Instead of creating the table each time, you can have a macro do it for you. Now I'm going to switch to another workbook to record the macro. You can follow along or take notes and try on your own later. To record the macro, do the following. Click the View tab on the ribbon, as we've done here. Click Macros in the macro group. Click on Record Macro. Now here you have the Record Macro dialog box appearing. The first field is macro name. Let's give it a name like My First Macro. And notice we are not leaving any spaces in that macro name, as they're not allowed. Down in the description, let's put in a comment that it will describe the macro. Let's just call this a simple macro. And we click OK. Now we're starting to record the macro. Any keystrokes or mouse clicks that we do will be duplicated here as in the recording of the macro. So let's start by changing the zoom feature on this so we can zoom in, and we're going to record this in the macro so it'll always be a little bit bigger for us when we see it. Okay, so I'm going to zoom into 200, which is what the other worksheet was. So let's click on cell B2 and let's start to build the macro, or build the table. So we had a number field, we had a day field, and we had a result field. And then we had the number 1 and Monday, and we'll use Excel's autofill feature to finish filling out for the rest of the week. So now let's do a little bit of formatting. I'm going to start by centering up the data in this first column, which is the way we had it, and let's also change the column width. We're going to right click and change the column width to just 8. In column C, let's also change the column width. This time we'll go 15. And in column D, the last column in the table, let's change that to 10. Alright, and let's also finish centering these labels on the top, and we'll go ahead and make those bold. And finally, let's put some grid lines around our table, and we'll do that. Put borders around everything, then we'll put in a thick border around the headers and a thick border around all the data. We're going to click on E2 just to get off of the box and take a look at it. It looks like the way we want it to be. So now let's stop the recording. We'll go back to View and then click on the Macros button again, and now click Stop Recording. Now we've finished recording the macro. Now it can be used. In order to use the macro, you can run it any number of times, and it'll give you the same results each time. So how we do that, let's start by opening up a new worksheet within the same workbook. And notice that we are in cell A1. Now in order to run the macro, click on View and then the Macros button and then View Macros. And you can see the only macro that's listed here is the one we just recorded called My First Macro. In order to run it, let's go ahead and click the button. Oh, you can see down here in the description it shows a simple macro, and that was the description we gave it. Let's click on the Run button to run and see what happens. And within just a few moments, a fraction of a second practically, it recreates the table just as we had left it, just the same way we recorded it. And notice that we started in cell A1, but we finished because the macro finished in cell E2, and it will do that every time. Let's do it again just to see, and this time we're going to put our cursor down here in cell J16. Go back to the macro button, View Macros. You can see it there. Let's click on Run, and everything is exactly the same. And you can do this over and over again, and it will always be the same way. So now to store the macro, how we want to do that? Well, if you remember, when we went to record the macro in the first place, there was this field in the middle. It says store macro in. Now the options here by default is this workbook. We're going to pull this down. You can see it also says new workbook or personal macro workbook. Now this workbook, like I said, is the default, and that just means that the macro is going to be stored in the current workbook where you are creating the macro, and it can only be used within that same workbook. The new workbook feature is really not very useful. What it does is it asks Excel to save the macro open up a new workbook and save it there, which is not practical because then you can't use it where you want it to be. So basically just ignore that option. The personal macro notebook or workbook, on the other hand, is pretty useful, and that's if you create a macro that you want to use in multiple workbooks. You can store it here, and then no matter which workbook you're in, so long as your personal macro workbook is available, and it should always be available when Excel is running, then you can use that macro. Okay, so that's some of the options. We're going to go ahead and keep this one in just this workbook, and I'm going to cancel this because we're not recording another macro. I just wanted to show you those features. So now to save it, we're going to do File and Save As, and we'll browse. I'll put this in a we'll put this here with this. We'll call this my first macro workbook. All right, and with that, notice that the file extension is the standard XLSX, and we're just going to click Save to see what happens. And this is what happens. It says here the following features cannot be saved in macro-free workbooks, and that's the VB or Visual Basic project. The macro is considered a Visual Basic project. In order to save it, you have to put it in a macro-enabled file type. And so what we're going to do is not click yes. If you clicked yes, then it would save it in the XLSX format, and the macro you just recorded would disappear. So we're going to click no. And now what we need to do is change the file type that we're going to save it. And we're going to pick Excel Macro Enabled Workbook.xlsm, and we'll go ahead and save it there. And now it's saved. So that basically runs through the ideas or the concepts of recording a macro, storing it in a workbook, and then saving it. And we'll continue on with new topics as we go through this training.